Thank you.
Our Father in heaven, thank you for today. Thank you for the time that we have to be in your word. I thank you for bringing Pastor Don to us, to lead us in the word. Thank you for blessing him with the desire to seek your word. More importantly, to give it to his fellow man, Father. Thank you for the sacrifice of your Son. You sent to this world, a world we know controlled by Satan, to save us from our sins and take them upon himself, that we may appear before you, Father. Thank you for the gift of the Holy Spirit that intercedes for us. It helps us, it guides us, it convicts us when we veer off the path, into right or left, and not on the true straight path that you desire for us, Father.
Yeah.
Thank you for the struggles. Thank you for the blessings. Thank you for all things, Father, knowing that they come from you. Thank you for this place that affords us the time, the opportunity to be in your word, to be responsible for it, for the proper application of it, for the wisdom of knowledge, the wisdom of application, that we may grow as acceptable men to those that come into our lives and to ourselves, and most importantly to you, Father. In the name of your Son, our holy Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, we open this study. Amen.
So we're going to be a conclusion to what we've been talking about for last time, I think. We began with the introduction to the Pentateuch. We covered the general contents thereof. We covered the place in the Hebrew canon, the authorship and the foundation of the Pentateuch, several authors and later editors, oral traditions, multiple authors and lead editors, and then lead editors of traditional materials, historical reliability. And now we're just going to kind of wrap all that up. So if all of you remember exactly what was told to you last time, we'll be fine. And we'll be fine even if you don't. So, it is agreed by more conservative and literal scholars that the Pentateuch in its present form is the product of more than one mind and of several centuries at least, and is a vast treasure of Israel's historical memories. Both groups agree that long copying of the Pentateuch and the translating of it into other languages resulted in many changes to the text, and that it is the common responsibility of all scholars to discover the changes and restore the text as nearly as possible to its earliest form. This work is known as textual criticism. Dr. Welch has offered courses. In fact, he requires, if I remember, that course if you, when the college was open, you had to get your associate degree. Pretty sure you had to take that course. That's one of those that is tough. I'm on page 35, at the bottom thereof. There is considerable agreement between both groups that neither testament describes the entire work of Moses, although both attribute substantial parts to him. That's from D.A. Hubbard, a conservative scholar. Passages that refer to Moses' writing down all the words of the Lord, this law and the like, and there's several references there, refer to certain parts like the great legal codes and the Israelites' itinerary, says Hubbard. This conservative scholar can even write, as far as Genesis stories are concerned, Moses may or may not have been the one who compiled them from their written and oral forms. He allows as credible the final editing of the Pentateuch during the time of Saul and David, with some modernizing of vocabulary and style. Even later, all quotations from the article called the Pentateuch in the Illustrated Bible Dictionary from 1980. Though Moses apparently did not write the whole Pentateuch in its present form, he clearly stands behind its laws, institutions, religious concepts, and ceremonies described there. He was the central actor under God in the liberation of Israel from Egypt and in the organization of Israel's life in its many sides. Adaptations of Moses' law and institutions to meet changed conditions undoubtedly were made in his spirit in later times and are now included in the Pentateuch. These two witness to the towering greatness of Moses. In sum, if Moses was not the author of the Pentateuch in the modern understanding of that term, he was its fountainhead. And the book of which he is the veritable center and heart is thus not inappropriately called the book of Moses. Dr. Welch's comment at the bottom of this page 36 it is evident to me that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. Jesus referred to Moses as the author, and that is good enough for me. And he references Mark 12, 26 and 27, and as touching the dead, that they arise, have ye not read in the book of Moses how in the bush God spake unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Ye therefore do greatly err. Let's examine this exciting set of writings. So, start with the first book, the Genesis. And you can see from the heading there that it was apparently written around 1400 BC or 1200 BC. It's a 200-year gap there, of course, but I don't know whether that's talked about or not. So the book of Genesis is a theological explanation of the beginnings of our universe. It tells about the lower orders of creation, like the plants and animals, the human race, the nations of humankind, the selection of Abraham and one nation, Israel, to be the historical vehicle of God's redemption, the narrowing of God's purposes within that nation, and God's providential protection of one branch of that nation, the line of Joseph. There are other realities of our existence whose first appearance is noted in Genesis. Evil, sin, rebellion, redemption, election, providence, and covenant. Other obvious realities that underlie the stories of Genesis, such as the creation of Satan or angels, are not described. After a careful look at all this, it becomes clear that Genesis is a selective description of the origin of things. Moses, under the guidance of God, did not intend to discuss how everything came to be, but only things that contributed to a religious or theological understanding of history. This is not to say that Genesis is only theological, whatever that may mean, or is untrue in any factual sense. When Genesis speaks factually, it may be assumed to be true, but facts primarily convey theological significance rather than scientific or historical explanations. So, from a modern point of view, much is left out that would be of great interest to scientists, sociologists, psychologists, linguists, and others, but that would be of less value to theologians. Theological themes in the book of Genesis. Several other underlying ideas of Genesis help us to understand the diverse elements that otherwise might seem only distantly related. The first fundamental fact is that God exists. The world exists only because God is and because He chose to make it. The world does not have to be. If nothing else had ever been created, God would still have been throughout all eternity. Second, Everything depends on God and is His. Nothing can rightly claim to exist by its own power or purpose. God is in control and knows what He is doing. Third, it is possible to reject God, but that is a very foolish and destructive thing to do. When God is effectively in control, all is well. When we choose to take charge ourselves, the result is evil, chaos, destruction, and pain. Sin is a tragic fact of human existence. Fourth, in spite of our rejection of God, He has not rejected us. Even now, God is redeeming people on earth. Every bit as true today as it was 27 or 8 years ago, or hundreds and thousands of years, however many years ago. Genesis shows that the essence of God is love and compassion for His lost creation. Finally, God acts in history. His involvement does not begin when we die and go to heaven. It is happening now. In the midst of human history, with all its problems, struggles, and uncertainties, God's presence is certain. It was known by the patriarchs of our faith, and as Genesis teaches us, it can be known by us too. So here's an outline for the book of Genesis. The initial creation is covered in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 25. The fall of humankind and its tragic results goes from Genesis 3:1 to 5:32. Chapter 5, verse 32. Crime and punishment, the flood and after Genesis. You can see the numbers there, so just look at those. The diffusion of people throughout the earth, the story of Abraham, the story of Isaac and Ishmael, the story of Esau and Jacob, and then the story of Joseph and the last days of Jacob. We'll probably go into detail on all those things later. The book of Exodus. The writer is Moses, 1400 BC or 1200 BC, same. The book of Exodus continues the theme of redemption. We see redemption displayed in the nature of history itself and epitomized in Israel's particular history. The great drama shows God's people cruelly oppressed in a foreign territory without benefit of a land or a human protector. God hears the cries of His people and sends a deliverer, Moses, to be the agent of His divine redemptive power. The redemption pictured in the book of Exodus is not just from oppression. God leads His people through a wilderness, providing for all of their needs. Then at Mount Sinai, He renews the covenant He had made with Abraham in Genesis, binding Himself to all the people of Israel. Here laws are given, summarized in the Ten Commandments, which are a further evidence of God's love and concern for His people. Rules are given for all of life, and a religious structure, tabernacle, priesthood, regulations, is established. The book of Exodus therefore describes a going on as well as a going out. After the Israelites went out of Egypt, they went on as a people in the wilderness, trusting the promises God gave at Sinai. Theological themes in the book of Exodus. The first significant theme in Exodus is the power of God. Nations, people, the sea, the natural elements, the wilderness, all are subject to His control. Second is the benevolence of God. He cares for His people, hears their cries, and rescues them. Third is the mystery of evil. It is present both in Egypt and in Israel, but God's will is still being accomplished. There is also a mystery in the relation between human and divine action. Pharaoh hardened his heart against God, but it is equally true to say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. There is also a mystery in the relation between human and divine action. Pharaoh hardened his heart against God. Oh, that's a repeat, excuse me. Finally, there is the importance of our human existence as part of God's plan. He makes divine provision for all our needs in the form of guidelines or laws. These laws relate to every aspect of our existence, showing us that God is concerned about all we do and are. So the outline for the book of Exodus starts with the bondage in Egypt and the deliverer sent. The Passover and Exodus from Egypt. Conflict and guidance in the wilderness. The laws of God given and accepted. The presence of God in tabernacle and priesthood. The book of Leviticus. There we go. Thank you. Appreciate you stepping in. Same deal, the writer is Moses. Same time frame, 1400 BC or 1200 BC. The book of Leviticus served as a handbook for the ancient priests of Israel. Much of it is devoted to specific regulations concerning offerings, sacrifices, ritual purity, ordination, feasts, and festivals. There are also regulations that go beyond the religious institutions and that deal with the events of life. The implication of those regulations is that all of life is, in fact, religious. All that we do, whether in direct worship or not, is part of our relationship with God. For example, we should not separate life into categories of sacred and secular, imagining that only the so-called sacred areas belong to God. God sees us as totalities, and all of life work, worship, relationships, creativity, family is important to Him. That awareness is a source of great comfort in the book of Leviticus. It says that we should not worry that the writing is of no interest or value simply because these rules were formulated for a basically rural, agricultural, and ancient people, whereas we are, for the most part, urbanized, industrialized, and modern. Some may wonder about the rules themselves, which seem to have no bearing on contemporary life. A slight shifting of our mental gears should help us to overcome these problems. Looking at the basic idea rather than at the specific rule, we can now see how each rule embodies a principle that is just as valid today as it was in Moses' day. In fact, it is amazing how current the ideas are. For example, the rule about sexual purity may be seen as emphasizing the sanctity of sex and warning against its casual treatment. The need for such advice today is obvious. Theological themes in the book of Leviticus. The theological themes that run through the book of Leviticus are of great value for us to consider. The first important theological theme in Leviticus is that God is holy and that He expects His people to be holy. This practical holiness is to govern our whole life. Second, all of life should be viewed as God's. We must never imagine that we can cut God out of what we are doing. He is vitally concerned with all that we do. Third, sin needs to be atoned for. The system of sacrifices established by God show atonement is a graphic way and pointed to the great sacrifice eventually to be made in Christ. The blood of bulls and goats can never remove sin ultimately. The death of Jesus can and does do that. Finally, our lives are to be lived horizontally as well as vertically. Our relationship to other human beings is just as important as our relationship to God. We are to love our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus said that this was of equal importance to loving God with all our hearts, and in fact formed a commandment with it. Our devotion to God is part of a total understanding of life, all of life in God's. The book of Leviticus was written to show the ancient Israelites and us too how to live in a consecrated way before God. So the outline of the book of Leviticus includes regulations about sacrifices and offerings, the priesthood and the tabernacle, regulations about human life, the great day of atonement, holiness before God as ethical living, festivals, feasts, and various other regulations. Book of Numbers, same authorship, same period of time. The book of Numbers narrates Israel's wide-ranging experience in the wilderness. Jewish scholars from ancient times until today have referred to it by the title "in the wilderness," which is the first word in the human text. In the Hebrew text. Duh. Others refer to it as Numbers, because the numbering of the people plays a prominent part in the book. Numbers is a difficult book to outline because it consists of a collection of material that covers numerous events in Israel's wilderness life. There are problems, travels, judgments, rules, admonitions, complaints, battles, and conflicts. All of these are designed to show that human life is a series of difficulties that need to be dealt with by the grace of God. With such an approach, they can be turned into blessing. The most significant events that stand out in the history of Israel in the wilderness are the departure from Sinai, the sending of spies into Canaan, the promised land, the rebellion of the people in refusing to enter the land, the judgment of God, condemning the people to 40 years of wandering, the failure of Moses, and the final victories of the people at the end of the 40 years. Theological themes. Certain things stand out theologically in the book of Numbers. First is the fact that the tabernacle is central. It points to the centrality of God in the lives of the Israelite people. Tragically, Israel's worship later degenerated into outward formality, a lesson to all of us. Second, God is in control of the whole situation. At no time is there any doubt as to who is running things. This is a comfort and a warning. A comfort in that we can rest in God's power and sovereignty. A warning in that rebellion is futile. Third, it is clear that God demands obedience. We cannot simply ask God to do everything. He expects and demands that we fight battles, face enemies, and overcome obstacles, all with His help. Fourth, life is seen as a pilgrimage. This theme is found in the New Testament use of the book of Numbers. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 says that all of these things were written for our admonition and learning. Finally, it is clear that sin is a problem that needs to be faced among the people of God. It is sad to read that even Moses was not without fault before God, but the way he handled his problem is a lesson for us all. Earth is not heaven. That is certainly no news, but all too often we expect our lives to be without difficulty or temptation. Numbers shows us that such an expectation is wrong. We must always be on guard lest we too fall in the wilderness. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament makes a big point of this, pointing to the rest remaining for the people of God and the struggles we must face here below. Outline for the book of Numbers starts with organization of the people of Israel, the memorial Passover ceremony, the wandering in the wilderness, various judgments and regulations, further wandering in Transjordan, more judgment and regulations. Moving now into the book of Deuteronomy, same Moses, same time frame. Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Pentateuch. It is something of a bridge between the earlier events of Israel's and the whole world's existence and what follows after Israel's entrance into the promised land of Canaan. As such, it looks in two directions. It looks back to the events that brought Israel to the point of giving into the land to claim their inheritance, and it looks forward to what life will be like when they are there. It also shows us how Moses, the great leader of Israel, finished his years of leadership and then passed from the scene, handing over the reins to Joshua. For the most part, Deuteronomy is a rehearsing of the laws and regulations given to the people when they were in the wilderness. Most of what is said can be found in the earlier books of the Pentateuch. Theological themes. Theologically, three things stand out in Deuteronomy. First, the importance of our remembering our past is emphasized. We need to look back to see where we have come from in order to know where we are going. If we have made mistakes, we should not make them again. If we have done the right things, we need to keep on doing them. Second, the importance of God's laws stand out. These rules were not given to be a burden to us, but to help us. God is an orderly person and has planned things so that our lives run best when they are ordered to. It makes sense to obey God. He knows what is best for us and has shown us how to live. Third, the importance of knowing God and worshiping Him is stressed. There is only one God over all the heaven and the earth. He is to be worshipped. The wonder is that God not only allows this, but desires it. The highest act a person can perform is to find himself or herself in worship of God. Following directly upon our worship is service to those around us. Worship and service are two sides of the same coin, according to Deuteronomy. The outline for the book: review of Israel's wilderness wandering, review of Israel's laws, final acceptance of God and His covenant, the last days of Moses. The conclusion: Moses, under divine inspiration, wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, and they can be considered as a reliable and authoritative source of the areas of interest they cover. The books of Joshua through 2 Chronicles. The introduction to the book of Joshua. Author: God. Writer: Joshua, about the 14th century BC. The book of Joshua picks up where Deuteronomy leaves off. Moses is gone, and the role of leadership is Joshua's. Joshua had been one of the two spies, Caleb was the other, who had brought back a favorable report and urged the Israelites to enter the land. They would now enter after 40 years of wandering. There are essentially 3 battle campaigns described in this book. The central campaign goes through Jericho and Ai and concludes with the treaty made at Gibeon. The occurrences in each of the 3 cities give us something to ponder. Jericho shows us the power of God. Ai shows us the wages of sin. And Gibeon shows us the foolishness of human beings. That's an interesting point. Hold on just a minute, I gotta make a note to self. Okay. Yeah, I pronounce it AI. I don't know whether it's pronounced I or not. I know in Vietnamese that's my wife's middle name. It's the name of the city. It's the name of the city. In my case, it's my wife's middle name, which is striking to me. But not that she's ever struck me, of course.
And how do you pronounce it in Vietnamese?
In Vietnamese, I say I.
I would stick with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to say I, probably to distinguish it, you know. The southern campaign involves a coalition of kings led by Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem. Joshua's army is able to defeat them by the direct help of the Lord. The northern campaign brings Jabin, king of Hazor, into battle against Israel and sees his eventual defeat. The land thus has rest from war, and the people of Israel now settle in to live in this new territory, which is apportioned to the 12 tribes. Back to AI. It's remarkable that I've never taken the time to learn how to pronounce the word. I think Ken's sitting there doing that right now, as a matter of fact.
Well, in German it's I. It means A.
Okay.
In Vietnamese it's I. I always thought it was I.
Well, for some-
Yeah, I am doing that.
It's interesting that you came up with it in German,
Yeah.
and we're talking about Jews.
I mean, German is the other language.
I'll find out one day.
Well,
Sure, Dr. Welch knows exactly how it's said, and I can't really remember how he referred to it. Okay, theological themes.
I.
It'd be easier for me to remember, yes, but see, now you're forcing change, and I'm old. I don't want to change. I don't know how you guys are. Some of you guys are young and you don't want to change, but I'm old. I'm tired of changing. Yeah, I like a few changes in several other people in my life, but so far they haven't been persuaded to do that. Back to the text. Don Knisley soap opera. Okay. Numerous important theological themes may be seen in the book of Joshua. The focus on the centrality of God continues from the earlier books. God is God, and His will is being done. His power to act is also evident, as well as His control over the forces of nature and history. The holiness of God is evident in the judgment meted out to the Canaanites whose iniquity was now full, but also in that Israel too was judged when it sinned. God is an absolutely impartial judge who will not regard one person above another. The mercy of God is also to be seen in the sparing of many from the horrors of war. The importance of human involvement and response is a central theme in the book of Joshua. God could have defeated his enemies directly had he chosen to do so, but he didn't. He used Joshua and the people of Israel. They made the decisions, marched through the land, fought the battles, set up the cities, and lived their lives. Through these actions, God accomplished his will. It is important to keep both facts firmly together in our minds. God works, we work. One other thing stands out, the necessity to make right choices. The choice was thrust upon the new dwellers in the land. Choose whom you will serve, either God or the gods who were worshipped by the Canaanites. Joshua made the right choice for his people as an example for us. The temptation to follow false gods is just as strong today as it was back then. The outline for the book, the time of preparation. Let's get ready to go, gang. The entrance into the land, the conquest of Canaan, the division of the land, and the settling under Joshua's leadership. So now moving into some more detail about the book of Joshua. 14th century BC, Joshua the author. The book of Joshua picks up where Deuteronomy leaves off. Moses is gone and the role of leadership is Joshua's. Joshua has been one of the two spies. Joshua has been one of the two spies. Caleb was the other who had brought back a favorable report and urged the Israelites to enter the land. They would now enter after 40 years of wandering. There are essentially 3 battle campaigns. Yeah, I'm not going to repeat that. We already did that. The southern campaign involves and that was a repeat. That's a repeat. Theological themes. Yeah, this is all a repeat. It's exactly a copy. Okay. Let's move into Judges. And let's skip on to 4950. Go to bottom of page 50 now. We can look past this. Yeah, the content. After the conquest of Canaan, the Israelites divided up the land into sections and settled there tribe by tribe. They faced numerous problems: building houses, plowing the land, planting vineyards and trees, digging wells, and generally getting established as a nation. It was not easy, for the new settlers were attacked by invaders. To protect his people, God sent judges to lead them. These judges were not legal experts, but military leaders. They were especially empowered by God to gather as an army, defeat the enemy, and rule over their district until things quieted down. There are about 14 episodes mentioned in the book of Judges. One man, Abimelech, may not have been a judge, but his story is given anyway, probably to show what a disgrace he was. The book closes with 2 particularly grisly stories, one involving religious deceit and the other murder. They show what happens when people forget the Lord and rely on their own strength. Theological themes in Judges. The book of Judges has a carefully followed pattern that is used to show how God works in history. Israel serves the Lord, then turns from God and falls away from his favor. To bring his people back, God allows them to suffer the consequences of their sin by punishing them through a foreign invader. Israel cries out to God, who sends them a judge or deliverer. Israel is then serving the Lord again. A great deal can learn from looking thoughtfully at this cycle of events. There's the fact of God's involvement in our lives, as well as the fact of our own actions. When we do God's will, all is well. When we sin, we bring disaster on ourselves. Notice the mercy of God. No matter when the people cried out to him, he answered them. It is comforting to know that God is always there to hear our prayers. Finally, notice the awful results of sin. When we choose to reject God's ways, terrible things result. The stories told are object lessons for all of us, for us. It does not make sense to rebel against God. Have you been rebellious of God in your life? You know, if you didn't, then you haven't sinned. So that gets you all. Fine. Okay, when we choose to reject God's ways, terrible things result. The stories told are object lessons for us. It does not make sense to rebel against God. In the end, no one benefits from wrongdoing. This holds true even for God's people. After all, Samson was not a pagan, but an Israelite, and sin destroyed his life too. The outline for the book: Conquest Retold, stories of the judges, the religious evil of the times, and the moral evil of the times. Old Testament survey, Joshua through 2nd Chronicles, title page there. I have no idea why that's there. Do you have that there also? Yeah, okay. Sometimes when I'm making copies of things, my collating doesn't work quite as well, and I wind up with shuffled pages. And I don't need to help myself be confused. I can be confused without any assistance of my own or anybody else's. I stand by that. What a testimony, huh? What a testimony right here on whatever this thing is that's looking at me. Book of Ruth, page 52. Wherever that is. There we go, Book of Ruth. Writer is unknown. The date is the 10th century BC. The times of the judges were extremely difficult years. That book concluded with the observation that anarchy reigned. No one was answerable to anyone else. The Book of Ruth shows a different side to this period, no doubt included to provide some relief to the otherwise almost completely bad situation. It tells of a famine that drove Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and her family from Bethlehem to Moab to settle there. A young Moabite woman named Ruth married into the family, and being widowed herself, refused to stay in their native land when her mother-in-law Naomi, also widowed by then, returned home. Her beautiful words, "Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God," have inspired generations of struggling people. An act of kindness from a kinsman, Boaz, is recorded, providing an heir for the family of Elimelech. Boaz was to be an ancestor of David the king, and ultimately of Jesus himself. It is significant that Ruth, though born a pagan, was part of the ancestry of Christ. Theological themes in the Book of Ruth. The religious truths found in this book relate more to practical life than to abstract theology. Loyalty, love, kindness, the value of persons, and the need to understand one another stand out. In the midst of the chaos then in the land, meaning could be found by returning to the first principles of simple truth. The Book of Ruth tells us that no matter how bad things may be, goodness can exist if we are willing to make the effort. The outline for that book starts with being in a foreign land, and then Ruth and Boaz, the redemption of Ruth, and then the ancestors of David and Christ. Unknown writer, 10th century BC. We're moving along from the 4th, 14th to the 12th, and now we're into the 7th. These two books carry us into the period of time following the judges. Samuel, as the last of the judges, was the leader just before a king was appointed for the nation. Things were still chaotic, with new problems arising with regrettable regularity. The religious affairs of the nation were getting worse. The economic situation was bad. But most difficult of all was the presence of the Philistine army, which threatened to destroy the nation of Israel. In the epic battle, Israel was defeated and the Ark of the Covenant captured. In the midst of this national confusion, Saul was appointed to be the first king. He was a strange figure who alternated between doing the reasonable thing and insane acts of violence. Because of Saul's fear of others, David in particular, he spent excessive amounts of time fighting the wrong people. Rather than concentrating on ridding the nation of its enemies, he was in effect chasing out its friends. Things could not last long that way, and in the end Saul died an inglorious death in battle with the Philistines. It was a sad chapter in the history of Israel. David was a different sort of king. He showed his military ability early, but he had remarkable administrative skills as well. When the time came, he was ready to structure the people along national lines and establish a government that would work. His biggest job was to defeat the Philistines in battle, and he did this. We're not told how, but it must have been a resounding victory because the Philistines never again presented any serious threat to Israel. David was not perfect, however. At one point during a crucial battle, he allowed his passions to overcome his reason and seduced the wife of one of his soldiers. He later deeply regretted that act, composing a psalm of repentance that even today is moving to read. That would be Psalm 51. Theological themes. Several principles shine throughout the pages of these two books. Foremost is the continued fact that God is active in history to work out his purposes. He could impose his will on us, but he chooses not to do so. Rather, he weaves his purposes through our acts in such a way that our good is affirmed and our evil is judged. It's a great mystery how God can keep it all straight, but we are encouraged to believe that all will turn out well because God is in control. Another important point is that God cannot be manipulated. When the Israelites were losing the war, they thought that bringing the ark into battle would bring them the victory. But God will not be forced like that. If our lives are not right, no amount of superficial piety will save the day. God's love and forgiveness also stands out. On numerous occasions, God was forbearing those who offended him. The marvel of it all is that God does not deal with us according to our sins, but in mercy. So the outline for 1 Samuel, the life of Samuel, the life of Saul until his split with David, and then David in exile until the death of Saul. The outline for 2 Samuel, the rise of David as ruler, the life of David as king of Israel and Judah, the rebellion within the nation, and David's latter years. In my daily reading, I'm just now starting with 2 Samuel. Okay, 1st and 2nd Kings, unknown writer, 6th century BC. After the death of David, his son Solomon ruled the still united kingdom. His was a marvelous reign, and the nation prospered as never before or since. He built a magnificent temple for worshiping God, established a sound economy, expanded foreign trade, modernized the army, and built a series of fortifications for defense. Great as all this was, however, there were also problems. Solomon spent more than he took in, angered the various regions of his country, increased taxes to the breaking point, and took himself too seriously as a leader. So the good and the bad more or less balanced each other out. And as long as Solomon was around, things went well. With his death, as is often the case with strong personalities, it all fell apart. Solomon's son Rehoboam was not able to keep the kingdom together. Following some bad advice, he took a hard line with his critics, and the nation split in two along regional lines. The north became Israel, led by a man named Jeroboam, and the south was called Judah, led by Rehoboam. Here we read of the various fortunes of the rulers of each kingdom down to the end of each. The northern kingdom was characterized by instability and bloodshed, but was visited by prophets from God like Elijah and Elisha. Both of its rulers were very spiritual people, and the best remembered are its worst representatives, Jezebel and Ahab. The southern kingdom had good and bad rulers with periodic revivals taking place, notably under Hezekiah and Josiah. Prophets of great stature were sent to Judah too, men like Isaiah and Micah. Theological themes for the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. The theological principles found in these books are similar to those found in the books of Samuel. The control of God is emphasized. In the midst of the chaos of human history, God reigns supreme. God's rule is based on moral absolutes. When the Ten Commandments were given, they were not to be seen simply as good advice, but rather as rules to live by. Excuse me a moment. Have some of my happy time juice here. My margarita. Got them on camera too. Margarita called Crystal Light. Where am I?
Last year it was Bush, and last week it was Bush.
Yeah,
Water.
the Anheuser-Busch water. Yeah, still have a little bit of that. Let's see. When the Ten Commandments were given, they were not to be seen simply as good advice, but rather as rules to live by. Any person or nation that disregards them does so at their peril. To stand by idly when abuse of the poor, the innocent, or the helpless is taking place is to invite the judgment of God. The nations of Israel and Judah are testimony to this dread but solemn fact. Another emphasis here is God's care for his people. Time after time, God sent prophets to plead with them to return to his ways. A refrain often heard was God's cry, for why will ye die, O house of Israel? The tragedy was that it did not have to happen. Sin had come between God's people and God. But that did not cancel out God's love. To choose sin, however, was to choose death instead of life. Another fact that stands out is the value of ordinary life. Throughout the centuries of Israel's and Judah's rise and fall, life went on with God at work in it. The people's biggest task, and ours, was just to live each day as it came, making the most of things, whether good or bad. First Kings talk about the death of David, the reign of Solomon, and the early history of the divided kingdom to Jehoshaphat and Ahaziah. Outline for 2 Kings, the divided kingdom to the fall of Israel. The history of Judah until its fall, and Judah under Gedaliah. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, writer unknown, 5th century BC. So we're about 8 centuries away from where we started reading. The books of Chronicles seem boring to some people because of all the genealogies and because they cover the same material as Kings. Isn't that unnecessary? When properly understood, however, these Chronicles are important books. The key to understanding them is to remember that the Bible was written with a religious purpose in mind and not a political or historical one. This is not to say that history isn't there or is false, but that whatever is said is recorded primarily for religious reasons. The genealogies are important because the Messiah would someday be a human being. These records show the family histories of God's people as a whole, from which the Messiah came, as well as of his family in particular. They are also important because they show God's faithfulness through the passing centuries. His promises can be checked by looking at the records. These books also lay heavy stress on Judah's history rather than Israel's. This is because Judah represents the family of David, and it was from David's line that the Messiah would come. The northern kingdom of Israel lived in a state of virtual anarchy, with assassinations and governmental turmoil almost a way of life. There was a measure of stability in Judah, with the rulers all coming from one family. Chronicles attributes this to religious faithfulness on the part of the south and apostasy on the part of the north. Not that God didn't love the people of Israel. He continually sent prophets to them to plead for their return. They would not come, however, and their destruction in 722 BC was the result of their hard-heartedness. The religious aspects of Judah's history are also prominent. A lot of space is given to the temple, its worship, the priests, and the Levites. Stress is also laid on the revivals that took place under Hezekiah. Themes in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Certain theological principles stand out in the Chronicles. First, there is the centrality of worship. So much time is devoted to the temple because it was to be central in the life of God's people. The same is true today. Where worship is routine or missing, whether in a nation or a person's life, spiritual death is just around the corner. Second, the faithfulness of God is clearly seen. Throughout the many years, when the nation's behavior merited only judgment, God remained true to his agreements, called covenants in Old Testament times, with his people. He remains true to them today. Third, the justice of God is painfully clear. As much as he disliked doing it, and the Old Testament says this clearly, God has no other choice but to punish his people. This should be a warning to us all. God does not play favorites. All will be blessed and judged alike. Finally, the need for daily watchfulness is evident. Too often our concern is for what might be or for tomorrow. What we ought to do is to watch out for today. Israel and Judah never seemed to learn that, and the result was their destruction. This need not happen to us if we learn from their tragic examples. So the outline for 1st Chronicles, genealogies from Adam to Saul, the life of Saul, the life and reign of David, the organization of David's government, and the death of David and the inauguration of Solomon. 2 Chronicles moves us into the life and reign of Solomon, the history of Judah, and the footnote on Persia. All right. We got a big old title page here. It talks about Ezra through Song of Solomon. That's his title. So we go ahead and go into page 59, the book of Ezra. Writer was Ezra, around about the 5th century. And the theme is the return of the remnant. When the northern kingdom was destroyed in 722 BC, its inhabitants were scattered throughout the ancient world and were lost track of. The land was filled by the Assyrians with foreigners who became the Samaritans of Jesus' day. When the southern kingdom fell in 587 BC, its prisoners were almost all taken and settled in one place by the Babylonians. As a result, they did not lose their national consciousness. Although life in exile was hard for them, thoughts of Jerusalem sustained them over the many years that passed until they were allowed to return home by Cyrus, king of Persia. Psalm 137 is a beautiful but melancholy reflection on those days. The book of Ezra picks up with the decree of Cyrus to let the people of Judah return home. Ezra was to be one of those who led a group of refugees back to establish the Jews in the land once more. The first wave of settlers who arrived in Palestine during the 530s BC did not find things easygoing. Cities had to be rebuilt, farms plowed, walls constructed for protection, homes built, lives reestablished, and a new life begun. All of it was done in the face of opposition by enemy forces. The temple was also rebuilt and dedicated in 516 BC. Ezra then led a new wave of refugees and was appalled to find the people so demoralized. A revival took place, and life was more tolerable for a while. Theological things. The religious value of this book is to show us that although life is never easy, it can be lived with God's help. The struggles of God's people seemed overwhelming, but day by day they made it through. Their strength came from the Lord. If we could learn this lesson, we could make it through as well. No one ever knows what difficulties a day may bring, but reflection on Ezra and his times can bring renewed confidence. God has not changed, even if the way he accomplishes his purpose is different today. Outline of the book of Ezra talks about the decree of Cyrus, the census of the people, the rebuilding of the temple, and Ezra's return. Nehemiah was the writer of Nehemiah, 5th century BC, and it talks mainly about the rebuilding of Jerusalem. This book is in some ways a parallel account to the one given by Ezra. Nehemiah was a trusted servant in the court of the Persian king, but was committed to his nation and his own people. When he heard of the problems they faced, he requested permission to go to Palestine to help them. His specific concern was the rebuilding of the walls. Without walls, Jerusalem was helpless. Nehemiah must have been a man of immense energy and personal charisma, because within 52 days the task was accomplished. However, Nehemiah found more than just broken walls. He found broken lives. Discouragement had set in, God's commandments were being transgressed, and religious laxity, even among the priests, was common. The situation was not much better than it was before the nation had gone into exile. Realizing that something had to be done, Nehemiah took concrete steps to remedy the situation. The result was a reformation that brought the people, the aliens who lived in the land, and the priests back in line religiously and morally. As a person, Nehemiah was a marked contrast to Ezra, who worked along with him. Ezra was a rather quiet, scholarly type who wanted to reason things out. Nehemiah was a man of action who literally threw people out onto the street if the occasion demanded it. Together they got the job done. Some theological themes. Two are significant in this book. First, there are ever-present dangers of the ever-present danger of backsliding. We must always be on the alert. If spiritual attrition could happen in Israel, it can happen in anybody. Second, God uses people, and they don't all have to be alike. Ezra and Nehemiah were different personality types, but God used them both. He will use us too if we let him. Outline for that book: Jerusalem's walls rebuilt, the people's repentance, the nation reformed. The book of Esther. Unknown writer, 5th century BC. The theme is God's providential care. And probably for me personally, one of the most interesting books. It tells a straightforward story. It takes place in Persia, where Jews were to be found after the return to Palestine had taken place. Not everyone went home. For over 1,000 years, the largest concentration of Jews outside Palestine was to be found in the region where they had formerly been exiled. The king of Persia married a Jewess named Esther, who uncovered a plot against her people led by Haman, the prime minister. Genocidal actions were common in antiquity and have carried down to our modern day, as was the case in Nazi Germany. When Esther and her cousin Mordecai brought the plot to the attention of King Ahasuerus, Haman was deposed and replaced by Mordecai. Those who had taken part in the aborted plan were all executed, and the Jews narrowly escaped a frightful slaughter. To commemorate the event, a feast called you could say Purim, I think it's Purim. Purim is probably the way it's pronounced, but look it up. Theological themes in that book. Some persons have objected to the presence of this book in the Bible because it does not seem to have any specifically theological themes, nor is the name of God mentioned in it. Religious content, however, is there. It is below the surface rather than obviously presented. The main point is that ordinary life is not ordinary, but filled with eternal significance. Events fit into a normal pattern of cause and effect, but woven through it all are the hidden purposes of God. Human choices are of great importance and have profound consequences, whether for good or evil. The book of Esther says, in effect, watch what goes on and do not be deceived by appearances. More is happening than you think. Sounds like the world today. Well, Esther becomes queen. The plot of Haman's plot is uncovered. The consequences of Esther's bravery. She wasn't brave at the beginning, but she was persuaded. Book of Job. Unknown author. Dates are unknown, and is very likely to be the oldest of all the books. And the theme is the problem of suffering. Actually, let's break there.
Amen.
Okay.
Our Father in heaven, thank you once again for affording us this opportunity to be in your word. Thank you for bringing Pastor Don to us safely.
And we ask that traveling mercies for him as he goes to and fro through his day. Thank you for blessing him with the drive, the initiative, the effort that he puts forth to bring us your word. Thank you for all the pastors that are involved in C Street. I ask for your protection for all of them, for all of their families, as we go through this pandemic that you have seen to continue its work in the world for your purpose only, Father. We're not to understand. Thank you for your Son, whom you sent to take all of our sins upon himself that we may appear before you, Father. Thank you for the interceder, the helper, the Holy Spirit that comes and prompts us on our way, convicts us when we veer right or left, encourages us, translates for us to you, Father, that we may be understood by you, Father. Thank you for all things. Thank you for the struggles. Thank you for the blessings that we often overlook and take for granted, Father. Thank you for being there. In all things we give thanks and praise to you, Father. In the name of your Son, Holy Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, we close this study. Amen.